It's the first School of Architecture panel in collaboration with the Center for Design. The topic today is, for all of us to share our work and just brainstorm a few ideas, how we approach low-tech, high-tech in our research and design. I'm showing this first slide, two projects. The first one, everyone probably knows, the Harvard Art Museum, which is right across the Charles River. A gold LEED certified building designed in collaboration with Payet. It has all sustainability ideas embedded, waters, systems, energy systems, and what have you. And on the right, we're seeing the Gando School in Burkina Faso. Many of us might know Francis Carey's project. It's a project that's very much community embedded, that uses local materials and systems, completely relies on passive strategies. It's really celebrated for its design approach. So now, we're going to continue conversating on what defines low-tech, high-tech. Would we call Carey's building low-tech? Designate the Harvard Art Museum as a high-tech project. So with me, for architecture faculty, we have Anthony Averbeck, who's a visiting associate professor at the School of Architecture, who's doing research and teaching on housing, collective housing. Just launched his book yesterday, day before yesterday. Tuesday. And we have Demi Fang, who is an assistant professor at the School of Architecture, jointly affiliated with the Civil and Environmental Engineering. She runs the Structure Futures Lab, where she advises a couple of students, and her research is in between data-driven design, performance, and structural systems. We have Carlos Sandoval here with us, also an assistant professor at the School of Architecture, affiliated with the Huri College, and running participatory design lab, doing projects not only in the US, but in different parts of the world. We have Jose Menendez, who's also an assistant professor at the School of Architecture, but also in art and design, who's running the graphic design lab and doing lots of work in communications, particularly focusing on Latin American knowledge and graphic representation. And so just to frame our conversation, the high-tech, low-tech conversation really is about environmental performance. The built environment experiences a myriad of challenges, and really our thinking about sustainability, resilience. We engage with all these different topics. Extreme heat being at the forefront, how do we deal with environmental and health challenges due to extreme heat under climate change. You may have seen the prompt, but just to remind us, really the goal is for us to think about how designers, researchers navigate the high-tech, low-tech methods across design scales, geographies, and different resource conditions. The big question is, when is simplicity a strength, and when is complexity a necessity? And when do we choose for a hybrid approach? And really the goal is to arrive at a resilient, equitable, and climate-responsive architectural futures. So a couple of questions that could arise when we really use the word high-tech, low-tech. Sometimes it's associated with economic status. Is it about affordability? Are we talking about access to resources? Or, the other question could be, is it about design intelligence? Right? Are we talking about how designers engage with their climatic context, cultural context? Are we really speaking about the approach and the methodology embedded in architecture itself? Or are we talking about energy, operational energy and carbon? Are we saying a low-tech design has a low carbon, low energy emission, or are we using other factors to really differentiate between the two terms? Or is it about computational power, thinking about the methodology itself? Is it the process that's involved in the design and thinking that differentiates the low-tech and the high-tech? So it would, allow our panelists to engage with those questions and, of course, beyond. So this is really both about design and as well as the methods that are employed in the design process, in the research process that guides the concept development, application, and the implementation of projects. As an example, I want to show these two buildings, which are located in a nice temperate climate in Africa, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. The first image you see is a Roman church in Lalibela that is built in the 11th century. As you can see, it employed the idea of subtraction, and really by taking up elements from the ground, they managed to create this architecture, which is celebrated for having a very effective water management system. It has been there for lots of many years and still standing. And then the other project, which is built in the city about 10 years ago, and it also employs somehow this idea of subtraction and addition, but instead of going down into the earth, it's constructed up on the ground. And it really utilizes all natural forces, naturally ventilated, nicely, they lit in interior-wise. It's a different way of understanding a vernacular or context-driven ideas, but implemented and customized for a more contemporary context. Another example from a hearing-dominated context here in Colorado. This is a project by Emery Levine, who is a physicist and a world-known energy efficiency expert. This is a home he built in the old snowmass, Colorado, arid and very cold climates. Temperatures could go down to minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit over the winter period. And he built this house, which basically avoided using furnace. He has built these thick walls, 16-inch thick walls, taking knowledge from kind of the vernacular, traditional way of building in the area. He used sunrooms where he even has kind of a garden. He grows banana trees, something you wouldn't even imagine. In a very cold climate, having a tropical vegetation is crazy. In one news article, they called his project a high-tech home. But then again, a question I pose for everybody would be called, this is, it really avoided some of the technologies we typically use and employed some other strategies. Of course, it has a solar thermal system. The architecture itself is promoting the performance of everything. So, of course, we think about global context. We always engage with global knowledge, but it's very crucial to act locally. So context very much matters. And in architecture, the low-tech, high-tech is not necessarily defined by the complexity, but rather how intelligently we have engaged the material, with the climate, and the human needs. So, before I hand it over to our panelists to share in a few minutes on your work, I want to leave you with this quote. Technology is a mindset, not simply a tool set. It's an invitation for us all to rethink how we define and engage with low-tech, high-tech in architecture. We may end up using various topics, various titles, and various descriptions. In my personal expertise, say vernacular strategies, fuzzy strategies, we talk about material intelligence, we talk about advanced computation. At the end of the day, the goal is to really diffuse the polarization of these two terms. It becomes about technological thinking. Um, so I'm gonna go over so that everybody could share a little bit about their work and how they engage with the same topic. Maybe we go first with Anthony, then Demi, then Carlos, then
Sure. Okay. Hello, everyone. Delighted to be here with my colleagues. So my work looks at collective living, right? And how, as sort of the basic building block of the city, housing mediates relationships between individuals, households, and society. So in the book that I gave a talk on Tuesday here in this Curie room, um, my co-authors and I look at 60 case studies that show how the design of housing doesn't just solve problems of accommodation, but projects ways of living together. And so while this conversation can be framed around digital tools and computation in the design process, I want to think about sort of high tech and low tech sort of more broadly as different levels of sort of systemic integration and complexity with respect to housing. Across the case studies that we've examined in the book, both low-tech and high-tech approaches in the design and delivery of housing at scale produce meaningful outcomes, but only when they are in alignment with the social, economic, and spatial conditions that they're operating within. So the question becomes, when is complexity actually necessary and when is simplicity more effective? I want to start with a contemporary example. This project's actually under construction in Lower Manhattan, where technological and architectural complexity appears not just useful, but necessary to the project's success. This is the ongoing conversion of 25 Water Street in the financial district by Central Rudy. It's a 1960s office building with deep floor plates and limited access to natural light. So to make the conversion to housing possible, the project requires significant structural intervention, right? Carving out new deep light wells, reorganizing circulation, and upgrading facade and environmental systems. And so in this case, sort of complexity makes the transformation viable. Without it, the building simply cannot support residential life. And a project like the Nakagin Capsule Tower might be framed as a high-tech solution to urban living, where units, in theory, could be replaced over time. But that flexibility never materialized. And technological ambition ultimately exceeded what the economic and maintenance systems could support. Right? The capsules were never replaced as intended. The system effectively became fixed. And so rather than flexible, it became obsolete. Right? So Nakagin was demolished in 2022. And I think it's an example of sort of when complexity and high-tech overdetermination perhaps is misaligned with longer-term social and economic realities. In contrast, Francisca's Gando teachers housing demonstrates how low-tech approaches can be both precise and socially generative. Right? The project relies on locally sourced materials and well-known construction techniques, that's sort of earth block construction, combined with intuitive passive strategies for ventilation, shading, and thermal comfort. The project is carefully calibrated to its climate and to its context. But just as importantly, the construction process itself builds local capacity and embeds knowledge within the community. So here, simplicity isn't a limitation or an oversimplification. In fact, it's intelligence and the project strength, right? Precisely because it aligns with local conditions and needs. So here, introducing more technological complexity and specialized knowledge would actually undermine the project's success. A project like Lacaton and Vasal's transformation of social housing in Bordeaux offers a different approach, one that sort of recalibrates rather than maximizes intervention. Instead of demolishing the existing buildings, the project extends them, adding winter gardens that improve natural light and ventilation while expanding useful living space. The intervention itself is technically precise, but relatively minimal in terms of disruption. The project uses just enough intervention to transform living conditions while preserving what already works. So all the cores and structure is preserved. The existing windows on the south facades were enlarged to openings into these winter gardens. So sort of light touch structurally. And so this is a sort of hybrid approach where design operates through strategic addition rather than total replacement. And so the question in housing, I think, isn't high tech versus low tech, but how we calibrate complexity in response to specific conditions. In some cases, complexity is necessary. In others, simplicity is more impactful. Social and environmental performance isn't simply a question of scale or technology, but of alignment between systems, resources, the context that they operate within. The challenge for architects is not to identify universal best practices, but to develop approaches that respond to the particularities of place, climate, and social conditions.
It might be online
chat that came up at the very beginning, so like that.
ask questions.
Yeah, no, that, yeah, that's.
Okay.
Wonderful to be here. Thank you for the invitation. The motivation behind a lot of my work is the high contribution of the building sector to global carbon emissions. And I have a structural design background as well within architecture. And so I'm coming with this from the lens of both through sheer material quantity and types of materials, how those contribute to global carbon emissions. Two principles for low carbon structural design that I'm often communicating to practitioners and to students are one, to build less and to waste less. So really attacking that material quantity and material efficiency side of things. And also to really think about how we compare options early during design, because early stages of the design process are crucial for performance before details of the buildings are locked in. And so today, I'm not as much sharing my own research, but a couple of examples from this area I work in of expressive and sustainable structural design and architecture that I think engage with this low tech. And maybe at the end, I'll touch on how my research intersects with some of these. So in structural design, one of the most challenging structural demands is achieving spans. So we live in a world that receives vertical gravity loads, and we're expected to resist those loads using horizontal systems. We live on these horizontal floor slabs that are expected to take vertical gravity loads. This is one of the most challenging structural demands to resist in pure bending. And so one thing that I'm always reminding my students is that the most difficult thing is an arch. Anytime you can achieve arching action in your horizontal structural elements is a much more materially efficient way to resist those vertical loads compared to horizontal elements in bending. And we have a lot of really wonderful examples of elegant and expressive arches that do so with very incredible levels of material efficiency. From 1515, we have the fan vault from King's College Chapel, which has the thickness and span proportional to that of an eggshell. And then in South America and in South Africa, across time, we've had these other really inspiring examples of vaulted structures. And I think to tackle not just beams, but the floor systems and the floor systems, which are really the most carbon intensive part of a structural system. There have been a lot of really exciting innovations in turning those large bending elements into vaulted elements, some of which comes from the UK. Here's an example of scaling and prototyping some of those vaulted floor systems, and several other examples I'm not showing here. So I think this is one example of taking a really fundamental principle and scaling them with construction and computational technologies to make them more accessible at scale for our, especially to address meeting population demands with urban density in our multi-story floors. Just to take it back to the history of the arch, this dates back not just to the Romans who famously built many arches, but even farther back to 2000 BC in ancient Egypt. Nubian vaults were made of sun-dried brick, and that already also contributes to lower carbon emissions compared to firing those bricks, which requires a lot of heat and emissions. And they also didn't require any formwork, which is also a source of material density. Didn't require formwork to construct these. As you can see, there's a little bit of a tilt here. That's exactly how they laid up those masonry pieces, so that you didn't need additional material to support the construction of this. And one more recent counterpart to this historic practice of masonry laying. This is an example from my colleague and former mentor at Princeton University, along with many other collaborators. You can see it's a very precise, elegant, doubly curved vault geometry, which was actually built with traditional expert stonemasons local to the area, using these AR headsets that helped them precisely place those masonry elements along that designated doubly curved geometry. And so I think there's a lot of dialogue with new construction technology about whether it will threaten current construction practices or especially craftsmanship. And I think this is a really wonderful example of that low tech and high tech working together in a really meaningful way to still achieve those first principles. And my mentor also gave an anecdote that one of the asked about the experience of the Masons working with this technology. They actually loved it. One of them was a gamer, and he was very excited to be able to have these worlds collide in a very fun and exciting way. And finally, one more example to share is from Anupama Kundu, an Indian architect, and this is Wall House. And what's unique about Wall House, this is a space that she uses for herself and for her architectural practice. Something that's unique, she's embedded a lot of very interesting technologies within this house, one of which is this floor system that you see above. And what she's done was she looked in the community and noticed these traditional cooking pots that were made in the community that weren't necessarily all being put to use. They were kind of more being made out of tradition. And she repurposed them to be used as lost formwork in thing of floor systems, and used this house as a demonstration of that system that embeds community materiality and in order to enable material efficiency in this built piece of work. So I always point to this as a really wonderful demonstration of ways of thinking about local community and embedding that within the construction practice in service of sustainability. And finally, just to tie things back to my own work, where I work more at the intersection of computation and sustainability. I keep these first principles in mind in terms of material efficiency, but I also tackle this question of how we approach design in early stage to be able to compare options early in a meaningful way. And I do try to leverage data to help support that. So some of my most recent work is looking at not just individual buildings and how to reduce the carbon emissions in individual buildings, but looking at more at what we can do at the building stock scale to address material intensity and carbon emissions. So what you're looking at here is a data set that we've curated from several open source data sets of the United States related to construction years, material types and sizes to kind of get a sense of what's in the building stock. So this tooltip is pointing to a building on Northeastern campus currently. And so you can get a sense of what type of data is in this data set. And the goal for me is to be able to leverage this sort of data to inform design and policy for low carbon structures at a wider scale than the individual building. And I just want to close by echoing what I thought was a really nice statement from Anthony. I completely agree that the question of high tech and low tech has to do more with how we handle complexity and apply it to local situations. So even though this is a very data rich approach, it's not something that's inaccessible to certain communities. It's something that can be leveraged through these interfaces to have meaningful impacts on in any community.
Hey everyone, I'm Carlos, I'm an assistant professor, and I run the Scalable Design Participation Lab. So this Scalable Design Participation Lab and my work in general is inspired by my time growing up in Mexico City, which, as many of you may know, used to be one of the biggest cities in the world. And one thing about Mexico City is that it grew up exponentially in the last 40 years, mostly through self-construction. So people were migrating from outside the city into cities, and they were building their own houses. So this meant that they were putting together the houses themselves, and they were also tracing the urban fabric on the fly. And Mexico City is not too different from other places in the world. There's this famous quote that in the next 40 years, we're going to be building as much urban fabric as we have in the entire human history, which is kind of insane. The idea of building as many cities in the next 40 years as we currently have. So with that in mind, the work that I do tries to leverage computation to provide tools for these communities that are going to be growing exponentially to support this growth in ways that are sustainable, collective, and collaborative. And I build these tools through, first of all, thinking about how the current tools that we have operate and how they were built, what interests they serve, and what do they allow us to do, what limitations and what affordances they give us. And also, as many of you guys have noted today, what are community practices, what holistic capacities and contextual capacities they have, and how can we learn from these practices to help embed them into our technological practices to hopefully enable these communities to grow in a more holistic manner. So as part of the work that my lab does and the work that I do, we have 4 or 5 main categories. I'm working on a book that is kind of like a history of science that looks at human-computer interaction within the scope of geocomputing. We build visual tools for spatial design and spatial analysis, which allow community members to visualize a lot of the impact and methods that exist in their communities. So, like Demi was mentioning, we have all this data, but it oftentimes is not accessible to stakeholders and community members and policymakers that need to leverage it. So how do we leverage graphic representation to make them accessible for the people that are on the ground? Tools for design collaboration. So how do we potentially get thousands of community members working together in contentious and ill-defined design problems? Participatory AI models. So how do we build AI models that are informed by conditions on the ground to facilitate civic data collection. So data sets that are accessible in high income communities are oftentimes not available in the global south. So how do we leverage collective intelligence and AI to generate those data sets so that communities can access them and leverage them, and community-based civic technologies. So one thing that I find super interesting and relevant about this idea of low tech and high tech is directly related to my book project. So the idea of creating maps with computers started out in the mid 20th century, the 1950s, mostly as a technocratic approach to reshaping urban fabric. So civil engineers, geographers, early computer scientists were invested in creating maps for computers, mostly to gather information in more efficient manners to reshape American cities. So Edgar Horwood got a grant from the Homeowners Association, the same association responsible for the redlining maps in the 1950s, to create one of the first and more essential computer mapping programs. So what he wanted to do was gather census tract information, demographic information, to make decisions about which houses and which communities should be raised. And as you can see, the representation of those maps is super crude. He would essentially just leverage line printers that would make character and then draw overlays on top of that. And he ran a bunch of workshops throughout the country to present his techniques. In one of those workshops, Howard Fisher, who was actually an architect and had no computer science or geography background, saw the maps that Horwood was making. He realized that they were really, really ugly. So what he did was devise a way to hack line printers so that line printers would essentially stop and overprint characters over and over at the same location. And this is 1959, 61. So what he argued was that this representation was much more accessible and would allow not only the civil engineers or the policymakers that were making the decisions to come together in the design built environment. So one thing that is super interesting to me is that Horwood's goal is to improve the aesthetics of computer maps. So his primary mission in hacking line printers was to make those maps more accessible and more readable to the public. But simultaneously, by doing so, he also allowed spatial analysis to emerge as a broadly used practice. So for example, in this project, where his lab, the Laboratory for Computer Graphics, that was located across the river at the GSV, he was mapping air pollution in LA. And one of the students, Jack Dangermont, who some of you may know as the founder of Esri, the major corporation commercializing GIS nowadays, was in charge of the project. And he's also native of Southern California. So he realized when they start plotting the maps on the right, that the mountains north of LA would actually trap the pollution inside the city. So he worked with a Harvard undergrad, nonetheless, to modify the algorithm that was interpolating spatial information to actually trap or model how air pollution would behave if it were to have a barrier, a physical barrier trapping the air. So this aesthetic and visual interface ended up turning into a spatial analysis feature. So years later, that algorithm turning to the basis of what we now know as spatial econometrics. But what I, apart from visual aesthetics giving way for spatial analysis, one thing that I found the most fascinating of this history is that those maps enabled groups of experts and non-experts to come together and have discussions openly about what the future of the built environment should be. So I might be running out of time, but I'll go through a couple of projects quickly and inspire on this idea of visual tools to facilitate people getting together and having discussions about the built environment. A lot of what my lab does is building tools for participation at a large scale. And this comes up from an earlier project years ago that I was working with Slum Dwellers International in South Africa, where they were trying to reblock, quote unquote, so reshape informal communities in South Africa with the goal of provide basic human services to this community. So because these communities were created from scratch in an unorganized manner by the residents, they don't have basic human services like water, sanitation, electricity. And they also don't have streets, which are fundamental for providing those services, but also for providing potential access to emergency vehicles, et cetera. So we were able to use satellite information. This is like 10 years ago, before maps of these communities were made available by large companies through their advances in computer vision. So we were able to leverage satellite information to map out these neighborhoods and characterize their growth and their this organization. So with colleagues at the University of Chicago, we came up with a measure of the entropy of this communities. And what we thought we should do was come up with an optimization algorithm to reorganize their urban fabric in the least disruptive manner. So what this meant was taking these communities and bulldozing some of those houses to make way for streets in the least disruptive manner. Obviously, this does not work, and when we would go to communities and show them this plan, that obviously did not work for a large number of reasons. So instead, what we have been doing was building, well, these are some models that I'm not going to go into, is to build collaborative tools that allow the communities on the ground to come together and tell us what their physical boundaries of space or what their cadastral maps should look like as a first step towards acquiring land tenure. So we can run these workshops throughout hundreds of communities that face similar issues, and each of them can tell us what their definition of property is. A lot of them have a more collective definition of property. Others are more Western-like. So this has allowed us to scale up these efforts in a way that respects their autonomy to some extent. Anyways, I'll stop there. I have a few other projects, but I've probably already
Conversation.
Oops.
Let's do the,
Oh, it's good.
let's do the sharing.
First.
Let's be, see how this lens.
Can you start presenting first? Or you could.
Yeah, so then you have the. Oh, but you wanted to see the speaker.
Right.
So don't list them, actually.
Yeah.
Oh, good, okay, so then. Yeah. I'm not sure, I'm trying to recreate it.
Okay.
So hello everyone. Thank you. Thank you for having me here. You guys are awesome. Awesome to learn about your work. And for the Design Research Week. I think when you hear the word technology, what comes to mind? I wonder for you guys, a screen, something analog. Probably for me would be something analog. We bring this prepackaged vocabulary to these conversations often, labeling high tech, low tech, as if one of them is better than the other one, or high tech becomes a goal. Low tech is the fallback, but out there in communities, and this is where my work is centered, those labels kind of fall apart. They don't really mean much. So from a community center design perspective, I have a background in landscape architecture, marine science, and graphic design. So a poster to me is technology. A postcard, a printed map, a wayfinding sign, they're all technologies. They're less technological than a digital interface. They're just designed for different users, different contexts, different parameters. These categories hide an important question often, which is I try to often center the conversation around this, which is who is this for? And what do they actually have? What do the actually people have access to? When we prioritize high-tech solutions, we often end up designing for the few who have the infrastructure to access them. So we often mistake technical complexity for social progress, and that's something that is often something that comes into light of my work. Communicating climate and activating public space through graphic interventions is central to my research. So I want people to see that everyone can help create change, action in their communities. And for me, there's not such a thing as a small action or low-tech intervention. This is my tiniest intervention, and I call it the postcard. The postcard is a tiny garden. It's a self-initiated printed piece on seed paper with soy ink to promote planting native species. And this shrub-like inspired typography reinforces the message, and each poster includes planting instructions and a list of species. All posters were distributed to the public for free. So hopefully I see lots of gardens out there coming out. And sometimes I bring my letterpresses outside to print with people using a piece of printing technology, in this case, from the early 1900s. And these conversations also ask, what if a book will carry ideas into places where digital tools can't? Like this 400-page new Farmer's Almanac that I designed for the main nonprofit, the Greenhorns, bringing together diverse voices to rethink U.S. food systems, land use, into 3,000 copies of things. So these books reach where technology can, into farmers and where people are in order to build community through that. Go with the Flow is a bilingual public awareness campaign. I worked in neighborhoods in Providence, Rhode Island, where most of my practice is, at their park at Providence, Royal Williams Park, to help mitigate flooding. And this campaign includes traveling educational boards, which explain stormwater management concepts to the neighboring predominantly Latino, Latinx communities around town. And through naming, bilingual layouts, translation, custom illustrations, the boards are designed to engage a wide range of park visitors. And this boards also have a newspaper box, which is actually really hard to find these days. And newspaper guides, right? That guide visitors who love newspapers and through the park stormwater infrastructure and share takeaways from their visit. And this focus on public space and community engagement also shapes my role of graphic designer for the 195 district and district park in downtown Providence, where I design branding systems, their public engagements at the park, while creating a banner system for the park that reflects local ecologies using custom icons, while highlighting the vibrancy of the newly designed public space. So this banner system has brought a sense of place to the park while connecting people to the river. And I have implemented very temporary wayfinding signs and programming since the beginning of establishing this park for last years for now. Lawn signage, sandwich boards, things that can just move around. And after 5 years of planning sign locations and looking at all the different possibilities, now we're installing permanent signage at the park, right? As a way, kind of using this low technology in a way that's kind of incrementally, it could become a sign at some point, And these activations over time began with design and painting 2 storage container murals that I started doing that. And this was to activate the park through colorful compositions at that time. And it's great to see how people have used the container as a photo backdrop, along with a 1,300 feet long construction fence, which often seems like it's a not to be engaged surface, right? But this interesting canvas, has covered the construction of this newly designed park pavilion that is opening this summer, while tracing a colorful line across the park. And you can see how the park, the mural, the banners, it all comes together. Even better here when I see these amazing yoga people doing this, which I can still understand, but they love coming out there. And I kind of think that they're like looking at the banners and they're like, yeah, but it's just a wonderful experience. And so these activations at the 195 District Park is out there. We have Brown University to the top right. We have downtown Providence, the Providence River. These have grown and evolved over time from a logo to now a graphic intervention of 10 parks covering 20 acres along the Providence River in downtown Providence. Where now we just deployed the campaign You Belong Here, which is we find a strategy for the Downtown Providence Park Network that not only provides information about landmarks, historic sites, and cultural organizations, but also aim to boost pedestrian activity and highlight the city's walkability. And so the wayfinding banners, it was composed of wayfinding banners, landmark banners in this case. Banners are often used to just promote very short temporary events. The idea was, what if we can turn this around? What if we can tell about the stories of the town, the cultural stories of the town, its architecture, its elements, and how we can amplify these stories and put them out in public space, so people walk more and they see something different. And for each of the 10 parks, we develop maps, and QR codes, where then you have you have the opportunity to not only know where all you are in the city and all the cultural activations or organizations that are making the city what it is today, but it also allows you to know who are the people, what are the things, what are all this content that is put in the banners that tell a little pieces of the story of the town. And so it has been a great experience to design this project and activate these public spaces we inhabit in the city, highlighting local culture and promoting walkability. A short thing I would say, I also have a archive in which activate collection of Latin American posters from the 1940s till today. And one of the things that I do, this is a mobile exhibit, and it travels and it activates people through public and through print and through analog techniques, original screen prints and letterpress prints. So it's a way to bring people back together to reunite and keep talking about what makes poster, what makes these pieces of information so culturally important, but also how they continue to create community. So as we look at this project from a tiny postcard to a park system wayfinding, the point isn't with software or technologies we use. Technology is a means to an end, and that is its connection. As designers, we can design for the sophistication of the tool or for the needs of the community. But when we prioritize the message over the medium, we stop worrying about high or low. And instead of the human connection, which is my case, my interest is in public space. So it's not as advanced, the project, at its ability to make someone feel like they're exactly where they need to be or where they're supposed to be. So that's something that drives the work. So thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Then open it up for conversation. If anyone has questions, even the panel or during the online audience.
Sure. Just want to pull the thread a little bit of high tech, low tech, simple, complex. Like they're not, in my view, they're not one-to-one, mapped to each other, right? So you could have, pick a device on the table, right? There's a lot of complexity, but it's pretty simple to use for most people. So how does that relate to architecture or experience in the physical world, right? Are there ways to use the high tech kind of in the background and create simplicity for people that are living there or working there? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a very good question. Just to give an example, thinking about building performance, for instance, natural ventilation or the use of thermal mass is some of the way simplest mediums we have available, which have been used for centuries. Somehow they're available because with the techniques we know, we can just go in or use them in a living design. And thinking about really understanding how those work, to adapt it in a new context or in a much bigger space requirement, usually it's customary to run, say, building performance simulations, right? So when you think about the analysis part, there is a range of options, right? So people would start speaking about early design concept testing, which might employ even simple analytical models, or it could go all the way to running safeties, probability models, or numerical models, very complex ways of evaluating. Thinking about the simple strategies, when we think about the methodology, it comes to harder, even when we haven't fully figured out how to basically fully model natural language, even though it's the most simplest resource we have available. You know, I see it really interchangeably going, you know, this increasing complexity question. Especially, you know, thinking about context driven or adaptation, we like or appreciate some strategies, but then, you know, that adaptation, the scaling up or the transfer of that knowledge is always what requires a lot of thinking. That's when we start to engage these complex models and trying to see if it really works. So I think it's a very good question, and I agree it doesn't map out identically. It depends on how we are familiar with the project. So the Gando project, Francis Pierre's project, is very simple because it includes all the strategies we know are there. Doesn't mean it includes all the becomes more relative. It's a very good one.
Yeah, because that's a really interesting project in that, you know, contemporary technology was used to both design, you know, the project itself, like Revit, Rhino, and software, right? But also to evaluate the effectiveness of passive strategies, right? So it's a sort of like visible high-tech process that kind of embeds, you know, the making of that idea. But then the transfer of knowledge to local communities is such that, you know, they don't have to rely on those tools to replicate knowledge, right? So it is this really interesting kind of transfer in some ways from like high tech behind the scenes processes and low tech, if you will, right? Like implementation. That I think, yeah, the Gondo project is a really good example of. But I would argue that's, you know, any good building does that, right? Like any good building sort of embeds knowledge sets and sort of you know, optimizations that might be, you know, come from high tech means in such a way that they can sustain themselves without a reliance on knowledge or technology going forward, right? And that might be just equipping residents with the knowledge of how to use louvers, right? And take advantage of thermal mass in their building, right? To not have to turn on the heat, right? So like, I think in any good architecture processes, the Gondo kind of sort of best embodies are sort of inherent to how they're sort of conceptualized. Yeah.
Yeah, if I can add one extra bit, making me think of, you know, the ongoing maintenance of the building.
Yeah.
Right. So I've got some interest in, you know, passive housing, right? I've done like a YouTube amount of research on it. But when you start to look at it, you go, there's a lot of systems here. I would need to be the owner of my own stuff if this house was sort of remote or what have you, right? So how do you, I guess, I think what you're talking about is deploying kind of expertise and technology up front, but trying to leave people with really durable, maintainable things. Like,
That's right.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Thinking about communities is also maybe another, so just an example different from what we know here. Some rural context, say, in an African country, and you present the community with kind of urban construction, adaptation of the kind of touched urban construction they know, but in a more kind of say organized or contemporary way versus you present the community with kind of modern looking material, which they might designate to be new. Could be iron sheet material or what have you, but in terms of performance, that's not the base. And so there could be embedded bias within the perception of the community themselves on what they think is high-tech or leading. So there's this other cultural component to it. So the performance we talk about is one element, but then there is this other component. How does the community or target audience receives what we think is performing environmentally?
Yeah, if I could selfishly turn this conversation towards the question I wanted to ask, I think it relates to the topic of how the technology to navigate complexity and relations with the people you're trying to design for. I love where you left off, Carlos, of like having a conversation with the people. So it's design with rather than design for. I'm super curious what those conversations look like, how you set them up. Do they have technology on their end to
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, and I think it's super interesting. I think in the architecture studio, we always start with a blank write-in model, right? So and that's kind of like the design method and the way in which architectural education works. But if we think about systems, where we ought to be thinking about systems across from like cultural systems, construction systems, natural systems. So like I think for me, technology is it allows us to afford us to have those conversations across different types of systems. And it allows us to do it in both a structured and an unstructured manner. In another project that we were working with public housing communities in New York City, Chucho, a student, a PhD student, also worked with what was said a little bit with the Rhizo printer. We developed this like low cost weather stations for monitoring the impact of public housing and some urban farms that a community organization that we're working with had in this environments. And so we deployed the sensors. They're like cheap. We had AmeriCorps members assembling them on site, and the New York City public housing residents were super skeptical, and they're like, "Oh, this surveillance, sort of like tools for keeping track of where we're going and stuff like that." So we had them in place for a year. We built this fancy digital tools, keep track and visualize environmental conditions. And it was not until we used printmaking to create a set of diagrams and brain track that brought physical explanations of what they were doing and what their environments reflected on these devices, that they were like, oh, we actually want more of this. We want to know X or Y things. So it's kind of like this interplay between enabling all the systems to be visible and part of the conversation and making the systems visible to community members. So I think unless we allow the communities to engage in their own ways with us, it's really hard to deploy the work that I have been exploring.
A very good Jose, then it's a good example how this communication, printmaking, and the graphic design component really helps supports other interventions. Just curious, with all the other projects you also showed us, of course, there are some qualitative observations you might be able to do, but in general, how do you really gauge the impact or the depth of perception of the works? Because it's very much embedded
in the space.
Change.
Yes. Yeah. Well, there's some tracking, we have the access to when people are engaging with the signs, right? So we know who's getting into the website. The park has, they count the people. We have about 1 million people walking for the year in Providence. So, we have those kind of measurements, some tracking in those senses. We know, for example, I know that the Roger Williams Park, it's my 1,600, I think about 1,200 newspapers I have printed so far, right? Because people keep wanting more. They don't throw them away. The technology, the boards and all these materials are there. They're not vandalized, right? So they're living in public space. So people are not engaging in that way with it, which is an interesting message, right? It's an interesting, it means that we're engaging with that. And, a lot of it is just, people just overall, they just engage with the material, because I think what the idea is, and I think we were talking about this earlier, is this idea of translation. And it's how do you create a communication system that translates this very, very wicked or very high dense engineering content, right, into someone that's that doesn't really have that in their daily lives. A lot of the things that I start with, especially when I work with environmental campaigns, is like, let's have a vocabulary. Why don't we start with a dictionary first? Like, what is stormwater? We can't think that people know that. And I think there's a lot of, when we're in this kind of world, in our worlds, we think that everyone engages with our world very easily, but that's not true. No one needs to know what stormwater is, I think, right? So we need to find ways to get people engaged into these materials, into these knowledges, right? Because these things are actually, impacting their basements, right? They're impacting their schools. They're impacting the way that the routes to pick up their kids and the way that, their everyday commuting, right? So these are things that are very important, but they need to be, we need to do a better job at translating these issues into the community. And I'm interested in that moment of what happens before a project is in there. How do we start gauging? How do we create interventions, small interventions to get people excited? I think the murals was one of those. And, how do you start with a mural with temporary interventions that get people talking about what this place is, and then sort of hooking people up that way, So rather than coming in with like, this is a big, the park could have been a branding project that I could have deployed, for example, in 1 year, but this one, it grew over 6 years. So people have been seeing slowly the changes, and they know, oh, so this is the park. So they get it, So I don't know, it's a slow way of doing, of creating a sense of place, but it's important to find ways of, engaging ways of translations. And that is different. A Latino community, it's, it's very hard. That's not monolithic. So, even though I work with Dominican communities creating health initiatives that are very different if I speak to a Mexican audience, because they're just very different. Same with like people from Cape Verde, or, so we need to, when it comes to communication, there's a lot of things to unlock there that is not as we think, that is not as A or B. And I think print is a really great way to engage people with, because you touch it, it's yours. I'm giving you something. When I bring the press outside, people love it. And I talk about climate in places that perhaps, that's not welcomed as much. But they go, hey, what is that? And I say, what is that? That machine? I was like, what year is that from? 1900s. Wow, right? And I was like, so it's sort of like, maybe what I found is maybe I talk about things without talking about things at first.
Well, it's fascinating, this notion of like representation,
Yeah.
right? And just how inaccessible traditional architectural representations can be.
Yeah.
Right? Like orthographic projections.
Yeah.
It create a sort of specialized knowledge set that can be very difficult to translate, right? And so what I'm fascinated by in your work is just the ability to, reach wider audiences, right, through our work. And I think, projects like Gondo, or Charles Correa's like housing at Bellapur, which is like a system of sites and services, right, in which they built one prototypical block, right, as this tactile artifact and said, this is what you could do. And now we've given you the system with which to build the rest of your community, right? And so I think thinking about ways of, conveying ideas and processes, systems, like Kara leaving bricks behind and tools behind, right? For the community to, not architectural drawings or blueprints, right? But artifacts, right? To pass along a sort of, oral tradition, and which I think, the idea of the postcard, this tactile takeaway thing, I just think is really fascinating. That's need to do more thinking.
Well, I think one of the things that you said that like the representation, one of the things I found, for example, is even in the creating this environmental campaigns for the parks, often I ask people, what are you drawing when you draw housing? And a lot of things is that 75% of people rent. So if you're depicting where people live, you should show an apartment complex rather than, there's just ways that we're just understanding like how you represent it. In order to make people feel seen on that environment, you have to kind of showcase them that environment that they're living in. And that requires a little bit of work. That requires a lot of footwork. And often, in architecture, I was there for a long time, continue to be in the environment. There's a lot of libraries, and these libraries are just, they're just kind of funny to me, because they're not, they're very generic. And so it's kind of thinking about that a little bit. But the print, what the print does, it leads to a higher conversation. It leads to another conversation. And I think that's what I love about it. Like the content of it is not right here, what I'm giving you, but at least it leads. And I said once, when these printing events, I often say, I want, people say, I'll put this in my fridge. And I'm like, excellent. That is exactly what I want my work to be. I want this piece of information to be in your fridge, because that is where the energy and the heart of the home is, right? So that's where people can talk about these issues. So it's like, where can we, in communication, I mean, obviously there are all the complexities that of the work that you guys are doing, but in my niche, right, and where I'm trying to figure out is how are we able to translate and get to people? Because we're in a moment where I think students are, in a way, they're tired of this digital stuff. I think that we don't want that. I think we're rejecting that. And I think there's a rise. This Saturday, there's a book show, multiple formats in Boston University. Check it out. There's a lot of people, a lot of students, a lot of artists bringing print to the forefront of it. So I think we're going back to, we're in a really interesting place that we're asking for that materiality. We're asking for human connection. We're asking for all these things for material, and I think that perhaps there's something there to continue to think about. But how to translate this stuff, right? How to translate your knowledge into the public is the hard thing.
Bouncing the question back to you, Anthony. Just curious how you picked the way of communication for your representation, the kind of diagrams you picked, the color tone, the diversity. Because, thinking about Gando versus the residential unit in France, that amazing building, the Sandoval, the Bordeaux building. Just seeing that those line drawings, you don't get the feeling because the colors, the ambience, everything tells you so much about the project itself. So I'm just curious, is there any specific intention in picking a medium of communication? Just if you want to speak more about that.
Yeah. One thing that we sort of debated was like, looking at different housing projects across typologies and contexts, right? Like do they want to have very specific particular modes of representation? Or does a universal system allow for greater comparison across projects and almost a democratization in a way, right? Of sort of like, this project may be much smaller, right? And perhaps lower tech, but we're going to represent it in exactly the same way as we do this project.
Like X-rays or something.
That's right. And so that became a really interesting sort of intellectual debate for us. And we very selectively interspersed photographs, but really relied on those drawings as the comparative tool, right? Which, unpacked the DNA of the projects at many different scales. So, in context, exploded axonometrics that hold apart, units from the structure, from integration environmental systems, right? And, for us, that was a way to have real dialogue, right? Without sort of biases about, I think this is a better project because of its material properties or because of its scale.
Size.
Right, that's right. Yeah. But it was a really interesting sort of dialogue about representation and how do you foster the kind of comparisons and dialogue that without again sort of maybe playing into biases that the image, the photographic image might convey. So we really downplayed the photograph in favor of a more kind of universal way of representation.
This may be a different type of project. I don't know if I got your Tiny Gardens project correctly, but were you making this postcards for people to then put together their own tiny garden?
Yeah, they're like, here it is. This is the tiny postcards.
So were they supposed to be drawing their gardens?
No, they do plant them.
Okay, cool.
You
Gotcha.
plant them and they will grow.
Yeah.
Depending on your conditions.
Gotcha.
Because I don't know if you have a sunny place or not. Yep. I get pictures and we're like, hey, they're growing. You want to get some. But like,
Yeah, because that's kind of like a different project that I had in mind. What if you get this postcards and get people to draw their aspirational garden?
Oh, that would be nice too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then how do you reconcile all those personal representations and how this kind of low tech medium lets you engage with a large and come up with some type.
Some sort of
typology. Yeah, so like comparing
what is
different mental model.
Probably the one I don't have to water. That's probably the one I don't have to water. I'm like, good, let's make a rock garden.
Yeah. I know. Awesome.
But I love this idea of the the representation sort of, because I think like one of the things is like there's a multiplicity of ways of representation, right? And like using them not as one way, but sort of as supporting ways, right? Like you could have, it's interesting, you could have one way to do one thing, but then you support it with other visuals or other things. So I have to think that, it depends on the audience. Like your book, right? It's probably for an audience that has, your audience probably know what they're looking at.
Right. It does.
Right. It has that kind of
like architects, designers
exactly
within our realm.
So they have some sort of training, right? They're able to see, sometimes I have like, I have shown a like an astronometric or a plan to someone and they're like, what is that?
Yeah.
Right. So there are things like, so it's sort of like this idea of like understanding your audience and you're like, okay, well, then how can you, like, if you were to present your book, which is fascinating into a setting, how can you transform, how you can bring, how you can keep adding to the backbone of diagrams is interesting.
We wrap up almost getting on time. If there are questions from the audience, yes.
The question of like the reliance on technology and specifically efficiency solution. And like what I mean by that is like in the transportation industry, respond to pollution, every year they make cars more efficient. And then that results in more people driving because that's more accessible. So in the long term, you're actually consuming more. I was wondering if you ever saw like that in architecture.
Yeah, it is like new housing versus retrofitting, right?
Yeah, that's one example, the retrofit question. But, there are so much dialogue, I think, going around the new buildings versus retrofit buildings. There are situations where we really like the idea of retrofitting, but it might end up being more environment. See, so it depends on the situation. And the technology, literally, it happens in most of the heating and cooling technologies we have in buildings. The older units types we have, there are so many buildings that use even second-hand AC units that are low efficiency, high pollution impact versus there are new versions that come up. The heat pumps have become very, now they're even making them more affordable so that anybody could install them just but then, there is all conversation that would happen at the end. What is the source of the material? And then it goes with the electric cars, the sources you have to manufacture the battery, where does it come? It's making bad environmental impact somewhere else in the world, while it's making cars here that are less polluting. So when you look at the background versus the immediate impact, everything we see is going towards more efficient system. Every element of the building is expected. The lighting industry artificial lighting industry has gone through a bunch of innovations. Now, even in our modeling work or the evaluation, we are caring much less and less because of AEs. Their impact is so low, right? But the conversation behind having natural daylighting is not the same as the one we had, say, 50 years ago. Yes, because the artificial lighting technology has advanced so much that it does consume much less energy. It's really everywhere in architecture, this topic of efficiency. I think Demi really nicely talked about the structural side of it. It's a whole field on its own. How do you make structures more efficient, their service as well as in their material one?
Yeah, but I think your question is super interesting because and it goes back to Jose's point, like having a dictionary. How do you find efficiency? And so like what do you value in terms of efficiency? Like in the 1950s, designing an optimal urban plan and bulldozing half the city because it was plagued by illnesses, right? So like how do you define efficiency? And I guess in a way, displaying those systems throughout multiple points of view is what one of the things that that technology allows you. And I know Demi works a little bit on life cycle assessment. So embedding that type of knowledge and systematic review of impact and outcomes, I think ought to be part of design education. So like you don't start with a blank rhino model. Start with a system that tells you different representations of what that definition efficiency might be. Then you have the agency to decide what knowledge representation use benefit.
Erin was in my class last semester. It was the same question in my class. So I heard it responding, but I can briefly
Give him another good grade.
I'll briefly respond my thoughts on this, which is that I don't think we can have some time to think about it. I don't think we can meet population demand for gross floor area through retrofit alone.
Yeah.
Like it would be a different question if that were true. And so as long as we need new construction to meet those demands, having a system that's more efficient is always going to be better in the long run. efficient. So I think between the cars and the homes, the question of does demand change with efficiency is a little bit of a.
And maybe it's, if we have time, just like a step further, what about circularity of the materials?
Yeah.
Right, I actually want to speak to you because I'm working with a group that is recycling concrete waste, but so that intention going in, right? So not only for it to be efficient, but are there ways to think about end of life and all that?
Of course.
Right.
So I would say being able to reuse the building in its current state as much as possible is always going to be better than taking it apart, trying to materials. But every degree of that reuse is always helpful.
And last, I know I'm the guy that talks too much, but brought up the example of turning an office building into a residential building. And the problem with the office building is this deep valley with no light, right? So are there ways of thinking out there right now about making an office building that's more adaptable in the future? Because that's a problem we have, right? It's all this vacancy in downtown, but they're not really a great place to live.
For sure. You know, I think it's the intensity of processes required to convert these office buildings, I think has shed light on, you know, just the fact that these are structures that were not designed for adaptation. We are really having to, you know, almost force into, right, conversion. And so, you know, I think with also changing notions of like, you know, maybe people don't want to be working in a cubicle that gets no natural light, right? And shifting notions of work, remote work, right? Offices don't have to, you know, accommodate permanent workspaces for everyone anymore. So they're getting smaller. And I think they're also, you know, changing in their morphology and footprint, right? Which I think is a much needed shift in that landscape toward more adaptable buildings that could more readily be, you know, transformed into housing or into other uses, and that weren't so specific to the sort of, you know, farm.
Because I guess that's the mentality of the work has changed. So
That's
the
right.
architecture has changed.
Right, the way in
So-
which we work has changed.
Yeah.
Which I think is a fascinating sort of development in how we think about workspace and, you know, even starting to integrate office or work co-working spaces with housing projects is something we're starting to see. Like where you have like a rec space within your.
Like in the first floor
That's right,
of
but it's
the,
not within your unit.
but it's in the first, instead of a coffee place or, you know, you do
That's
have
right.
like,
It's such a change from trying to make the most of your real estate, right? That U shape is inherently going to be a less efficient use of the parcel and just changing that like the design negotiation.
Let's make that our kind of concluding conversation. Thank you everyone for joining us. It was a very enjoyable conversation, and I realized we have much more in common. I understood earlier, but yeah, let's keep the conversation going. I'm sure the video recording will be available online at some point. If anyone wants to go back and reference or share with friends. Otherwise, we see you back again in another panel of conversation, maybe next year.
Yeah, in an hour.
There's another one.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone. Okay,